All right, hello and welcome to your lesson 3, Evolution of Classical Liberalism. It's a great lesson. I hope you enjoy it. So you've been learning about classical liberalism, the Industrial Revolution, and you've been learning about what life was like for most people during this time. Most people, it wasn't great, right? And so for that reason, many people were critical of classical liberalism, this new ideology that really only benefited a small number of people, right? And so many of the people who were criticizing this ideology were starting to identify themselves as being socialist. They were identifying themselves with this newer ideology that was more of a left-wing ideology that focused more on the principles of collectivism. And some of the things that socialists had to say about classical liberalism were, well, now there was an increased gap between the rich and the poor. There was lots of child labor. Many children were dying young because of the terrible conditions and where they were working and where they were living was not very safe and wasn't very good for people. So there were many reasons to criticize classical liberalism. And so the socialist movement was growing and growing, and more people were identifying as socialist. And people who were business owners and people who were members of the government, they were starting to see the socialists as being a threat, right? They were worried that maybe there was going to be a communist revolution. You guys learned about Karl Marx and the things that he had to say about the communist revolution. Well, a lot of business owners and governments, they were very afraid of having a communist revolution in their countries, right? So through the pressure that the public put on them, many classical liberals grudgingly, meaning they didn't want to, but they felt like they had to, recognize that some modifications were necessary. They needed to either make changes to classical liberalism or live with the threat of possibly having a communist revolution in their country. All right, so the public was pressuring their governments and their business owners for a few different things. So first of all, they wanted to be able to form unions. Here are some people who are forming unions so that they can demand better working conditions and better pay from their bosses. And they were also demanding this social safety net. All right, so a social safety net is when you are helped by the government in moments where you are in need. So things like employment insurance and old age pension and disability insurance and things like that, where you get helped when you need it, or health insurance, right, for healthcare. So the first thing that we're going to talk about to show that classical liberalism evolved and changed over the years is the Factory Acts. There were many, many, many different Factory Acts that were passed in Britain, all the way from the 1800s into the early 1900s. We're just going to look at a few of them. So let's start with the year 1802. The Factory Acts of 1802, what changes were made? Well, first of all, the boss must now follow the law, which was not the case before. The rooms in the factory have to be washed twice a year. They must be well ventilated. Okay, so not very strict rules so far in this first one. Children must be given clothes, right? So this is a time of child labor, and it was decided that the boss has to give them some clothes. Children cannot work more than 12 hours a day. Think about it. The amount of time you spend in school is, I think, 6.5 hours. Children were working for up to 12 hours at the time. And children must be taught reading, writing, and math. Okay, fast forward to 1833. There was another set of factory acts that were passed in 1833. Now it became illegal to hire kids under the age of 9. And kids over 13 can't work more than 9 hours a day and 48 hours a week. Okay, so we're starting to see that child labor is still allowed, but we're starting to regulate child labor a little bit more. In 1878, what do we see? All kids must go to school until they turn 10. And between 10 and 14, kids can only work half of the day. Okay, so all of a sudden kids are starting to get some education and less time working. And then 1874. Oh, I think my order is off a little bit here. No workers can work more than 56.5 hours per week, okay, which is an improvement from before. So what do we see? Well, throughout the years, throughout the century, we see gradual restrictions on child labor. Child labor still exists, but now it's more regulated by the government. We see gradual improvements to the working conditions of both children and adults. And we see some gradual limitations on working hours, right? So people are having to work fewer and fewer hours. So these factory acts, are they a return to the past? Are they maintaining the status quo? Are they progress, or are they extreme radical changes? I would say they're liberal, right? They are progressive. These factory acts, they represent small steps forward for society. Next, we're going to talk about labor unions. So if you look at this image, you see that the labor unions, the way they work is people work together, right? So the workers, the the working class members of society, if they unite, then they can be powerful. If they put their hands together and they have power in numbers, then they can accomplish a lot more than having to be on their own. So the values and beliefs of classical liberalism had brought greater liberty to entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs, these are business owners, okay? Not the workers in those factories. So factory owners, mine owners, investors. So the passing of labor laws established labor standards that benefited the working class. But these were the result of collaboration between the government and the owner class, so the business owners. And the working class members of society, they were not part of the negotiations. They were not able to negotiate with the government when they came up with these new labor laws. And during the 19th century, so during the 1800s, laborers, which means workers, wanted to have a voice in decision making, and they began to attempt to form unions, right? And they figured that through the forming of unions, then they would have more of an ability to negotiate and to come up with agreements with the government and their business owners to come up with better working conditions and to come up with better working, like their wages and vacation time, things like that. Okay, so I want you to pause this video in a minute here and read pages 127 and 128 in your textbook. I should have these pages up on D2L if you don't have your textbook with you. And these are the three questions I want you to answer. You can record your answers directly in your partial notes. So go and do that now. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your textbook reading. I hope you learned a lot about these three things right here. And if you come join us in class in the next little while, then you're going to see us, discussing the answers to these questions. So we know that unions gradually prevailed. So eventually, unions became popular and common in most liberal democracies of the world, sort of in the early 1900s. Okay, and then even in 1919, the International Labor Organization was formed and it became part of the League of Nations. That good old League of Nations that we still have today, right? Nope, just kidding. It was gone just a few years later. So, what kinds of things did labor unions want to change during the late 1800s and early 1900s? Well, they were very focused on the following things. They wanted to limit their workday hours. They wanted safe working conditions. They wanted to protect their job security, meaning that their boss couldn't just fire them for no reason. They wanted medical benefits. So they wanted to be able to see the doctor, see the dentist, and get help without having to pay a lot of money on their own. They also wanted legal services. They wanted the ability to sue their bosses or protect themselves from their bosses by having lawyers who could help them. And that's something that unions can provide their members with. So, pretty big example of the strength and the power of unions in Canada, at least, happened in the year 1919 in the city of Winnipeg, which is in the province of Manitoba. So here you have a picture of it because By this time in history, they had cameras. And so this was the Winnipeg General Strike. So a strike is when people decide that they're not going to work because they're so mad and they have things that they want to accomplish, things that they want their bosses to do for them. And so they decide we're not going to work until our demands are met. So I want you guys to do a little bit of reading again. Read page 137 and write 3 sentences containing the main points of the article. You can write this directly in your partial notes. There we go. Now, take a look at this chart right here. We have the British electoral reforms. So this lesson is all about how classical liberalism evolved and changed over the years. So let's see the change that occurred in Britain. So in the years before 1832, only 2% of the population was able to vote. Is that incredible or what? So in order to be able to vote, you had to be, first of all, a man. Women did not have the right to vote. You also had to be white. So any person of color did not have the right to vote. And on top of that, you had to own land. You had to own property. And so when you have all those criteria, what you're left with is only 2% of the population. But there was this big, massive, very important reform bill that happened in 1832. And that increased the amount of people who were allowed to vote all the way up to 3%. All right, so maybe it wasn't that big. And then 1867, we moved up to only 7% of people were eligible to vote. And by 1888, it was only 14%. So still, most people were not allowed to vote, even by 1884 in Britain. Let's look at Canada's progression towards universal suffrage. By the way, universal suffrage. Let's look at these words for a moment. Universal means something that applies to everybody. Everybody is allowed to do it. Suffrage does not mean suffering. Okay, so please do not write this in your written responses that suffrage means suffering. No, universal suffrage means everybody is allowed to vote. Suffrage means voting. So take a look at this. You know what? I won't read it out to you. I'll just let you take a look at it yourself. You can pause the video or you can look at your partial notes. It's really quite interesting to see how recently many Canadian people were not allowed to vote. So let's talk about feminism and let's talk about women's suffrage. So women having the right to vote. First of all, let's talk about feminism. What does it mean to be a feminist? Are you a feminist? Am I a feminist? What is a feminist? All right, so let's talk about the definition of feminism. Feminism is the belief in the social, political, and economic equality of women. Basically means that if you are a feminist, it means that you believe women should have equal rights in society. Okay, so I imagine, well, I would hope that all of us are feminists under that definition at least. So the Industrial Revolution really changed the role of women in society, didn't it? So before the Industrial Revolution, women typically stayed home. They would take care of the children. They were in charge of making the meals, taking care of the yard, the house. It was an era of this idea of men and women occupying separate spheres in society, where the man's sphere, the man's role in society, was to be the one who works and makes money for the family, to be involved in leadership positions in society, and women, their sphere, their role was to be at home with the kids, and that changed a little bit, to a certain degree. It changed during the Industrial Revolution because women started to work outside of their homes. Women started working in the factories. They were the preferred employee in a lot of these factories that we would now call sweatshops, right? Textile factories. And so that allowed them to make some money for themselves, which changed their role in society a little bit. But in reality, they still were not taking on leadership roles in society. Women were still, very much marginalized in society. They didn't have equal rights to men. And also, as soon as a woman would marry a man, normally then they would go home and they would stop working. Okay, and also usually the boss in these factories was a man, right? And the owners of the businesses were all men. So women, they were starting to work, but they were not really getting into leadership positions at all. But by the mid 1800s, some people were starting to think that women should have the same rights as men, right? Like women were now working. Maybe they should have equality with men, right? And remember that one Enlightenment philosopher who believed that women should have the same rights as men. What was his name? Do you remember his name? It was John Stuart Mill. Yeah. And he was actually alive a little bit later than most Enlightenment philosophers. He was actually alive in the 1800s. So, some of the people who really were the leaders in this movement to get women equal rights, these were suffragettes, which means that they were members of organizations who fought for women's suffrage to allow women to have the right to vote. And so we're going to look at a suffragette that worked to get women the right to vote here in Canada. In 1867, this woman became the first female doctor in Canada, and her name was Emily Stowe. Very important part of Canadian history. And so in 1877, Emily Stowe, she founded the Toronto Women's Guild, which was an organization that fought for women's suffrage. And so, so she became a doctor, but she had to go to the United States to become trained. We like to think of ourselves here in Canada as being a little bit more progressive than the United States, but in reality, in 1867, Canadian universities were not allowing women to train to become doctors. And so she had to go down to the States to have that done. Okay, so how would she be considered? Well, I think today we would look back and say that she was a liberal, she was a progressive, right? Because she was fighting for progress without wanting to make fundamental changes to the way society worked. However, her opponents, people who were against the idea of women being allowed to vote, they would have seen this as being a radical idea, right? They would have thought that, whoa, this is ridiculous. Women can't vote. Women can't make decisions. We can't trust women, right? And so it depends whose perspective we're talking about, right? So between the 1890s and 1920, many countries began to give women the right to vote. So if you take a look at this map is super interesting. It's got all the countries of the world, and it tells you in what year women were given the right to vote. So let's see. I'll make a few honorable mentions here. We got 1902. This was Australia. 1893. This is New Zealand. Okay. This would be the USSR in 1917. Where else are we going to go? 1920, the United States. 1917 in Canada, although they didn't actually vote until 1918. If you look at Central America, actually, I can't really see the numbers in Central America. If you look at Africa, a little bit later for many African nations. If you look at China, 1947. If you look in the Middle East, you're going to see some numbers that are a lot later than the rest of the world. So Canada gave women the right to vote, or at least women had the ability to vote for the first time in 1918. So you can pause this video for a moment and you can look up some other countries that you find an interest in, any country you want. Find out when they gave women the right to vote. And here are some countries that students looked up in my last lesson, last time I was teaching this in class. They found that Iceland gave women the right to vote in 1915. USSR gave women the right to vote in 1917. Germany, 1918. Philippines, 1937. North Korea, 1947. Although, a vote in North Korea doesn't mean much. Chile in 1949. And Saudi Arabia, here we go, 2011. Right, I remember when that happened. So our last part of this lesson is on the non-persons movement. So even though women had gained the right to vote here in Canada, they were still considered non-persons under the law. What does that mean? So under the eyes of the law, women were not yet recognized as being persons. So the British common law, which was used in Canada at the time, stated that women are persons in the matters of pains and penalties, but not in the matter of rights and privileges, right? So when it comes to women being prosecuted and penalized for things, for crimes and stuff, then they are persons. But when it comes to having rights and privileges, not so much. So here comes Emily Murphy. She was a judge at the time, and lawyers would often challenge her rulings, right? When she would say, when she would rule in favor of one side or the other, lawyers would say, well, we can't be listening to you because you're not a person under Canadian law, right? And so the famous five, these were five very important feminists in Canada who fought to have women considered persons according to Canadian law, right? And there's a video that I show in class about this. And they took their case to Canada's highest court, the highest court at the time at least, and they won. And so women are now recognized as being persons in every way that men are persons, according to Canadian law. So great story. You can find statues of these five women at where can you see it? Downtown. Yeah, if you go downtown, where is that? Is that Olympic Plaza? I think it is downtown here in Calgary, and you can see the statues of these famous five. So that's awesome. Okay, and then if you join us in class, you're going to see clips of this movie. It's called Iron Jawed Angels, and it goes over the story of women fighting for the right to vote in the United States. Okay, so there we go. That's lesson 3. I hope you enjoyed it.